Anyway, looks like I hit the big time, fellas. So today's video comes from a guy who goes by Blaze the Movie Fan. For those of you who aren't familiar with this guy, basically he's a film review channel. So if you're familiar with the Nostalgia Critic or Mysterious Mr. Enter or Pie Guy Rules, it's similar type of content. Well, one of the things that Blaze here does are annual reviews of what he feels to be are the worst videos on YouTube. And wouldn't you know it, one of my videos ended up on his worst of 2020 list. Now let me just take a moment to say how sort of excited I am about this. Like, here I am, a small channel with less than 200 subs, getting the attention of big YouTubers like this. Like, it almost feels like I was put in some sort of Hall of Fame or something. Of all the videos made in 2020, this guy came across my humble little channel and decided one of my videos deserves a spot on his list. Like, in a way, it's almost kind of flattering. So of course the video in question is this one right here. It's the first video in which I ever responded to Professor Stick, in which I defend Computing Forever's arguments regarding the insanity of face masks. Now this, for better or worse, has basically become my most viewed video. Truth be told, I never imagined this video taking off the way it did. I also would have never imagined this being my most controversial video. Like, I have tons of videos where I criticize all different forms of government authoritarian measures. Who knew that the one that people would most vehemently be compelled to defend are small pieces of cloth? But I've noticed that masks, along with a lot of other COVID measures, have become almost kind of like a religion at this point. People get super pissed off and offended if you criticize them, even slightly. Anyways, the first official contact I had with Blaze was this comment here on the original video, in which he says, quote, "Oh my god, your point that the COVID rules are about limiting freedom hurts my brain so much. Also, for the most part, all you did was paraphrase Computing Forever's points. His video is bad, which makes yours bad in return. Sorry, I'm not a fan of this video." End quote. So to start off, I respect this guy's opinion and I thank him for sharing it. I don't have to agree with everything I say in all my videos. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But this seems like a very dry criticism of what I have to say. Like, he doesn't really debunk my points about the COVID rules restricting freedom. He just kind of says it hurts his brain. Which, maybe it does hurt his brain, I don't know. But that's not necessarily an argument against it. He also says that all I do is paraphrase Computing Forever's points, but he never explains why he feels this is the case. As a matter of fact, while I agree with Computing Forever in general, there's a few places where our opinions on masks tends to deviate. For example, Computing Forever seems to be completely and wholesale against masks. Whereas I personally don't care if you want to wear a mask, just don't force one onto me. Like, I don't mind if Blaze wants to criticize what I have to say. He has every right to do so. I just like maybe a little bit more of a fleshed out explanation. Also, this guy has a bit of an interesting accent. It sounds sort of like a mix between German and Indian. Turns out this guy is from Iceland. Anyways, he did say he'd be interested in watching a response to my segment to that video. Well, good sir, mask and you shall receive. Boom clash.
Number 5. Defending Computing Forever on face masks. Response to Professor Stick by Philo Possum. Now, I fucking hate anti-maskers with a passion.
Well, I was never really one to hate someone personally just because they hold opinion I disagree with. But most importantly, I'm not really an anti-masker. This is a point I've made abundantly clear in multiple videos of mine, but I personally don't really care if you want to wear a mask. Like, if you've done the research and you've determined that it's necessary to protect you or those around you, then fine. Go ahead and wear one. Knock yourself out. This is a point that I feel needs reiterating. It's not the masks themselves that I'm against. It's the fact that people are being forced to wear them even if they don't want to.
The COVID situation is fucking horrible.
I agree the COVID situation in this country is pretty horrible, but I'd also argue that has less to do with COVID itself and more with the government reaction to it. You see, once upon a time when the virus was brand new, there may have been a time when all the fear-mongering was warranted, because, you know, it was a new virus, nobody knew anything about it. Now that we've had a year to deal with it, plenty of research has been done on the virus, we now understand way more about it than we used to. For example, we now know that COVID is seasonal, like a lot of other illnesses. It peaks and wanes in different times of the year, kind of like influenza. We also know that COVID mostly affects certain demographics and is largely harmless to certain segments of the population. Now that we have a better understanding of what COVID is, how deadly it is, and who it primarily affects, we now know that COVID really isn't any more deadly than a typical seasonal illness. And that's the ticket right there. Had we handled COVID the same way we handled any other typical seasonal illness, you know, letting young healthy people go out and catch it and build up an immunity while we focus protection specifically on more vulnerable people, there's a good chance we would have come out of this whole situation way better than than we did. But no, instead the government decided that you're too stupid to figure out how to deal with this yourself, so we're going to impose our solutions onto you. Which of course meant imposing strict lockdowns, which ruined the economy and destroy people's lives. And for what? The virus just continued to spread anyways. So we destroy the economy and people's lives, ultimately to accomplish nothing. That's the government's solution for you.
And those assholes aren't helping. In fact, they are making the situation even worse.
Do you have any data to back up your assertion that anti-maskers are somehow making the COVID situation worse? Because as Tom Woods mentions in his podcast, there's almost no correlation between when a mask mandate was introduced in an area and the number of COVID cases in that area. Some places actually experienced an increase in COVID cases after their mask mandate was introduced. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that masks make the situation worse, but it does undermine the position that masks make things better. As a matter of fact, Texas actually experienced a decrease in COVID cases once their mask mandate was lifted. Now, I'm aware this isn't a solid refutation of the effectiveness of masks. There may be other factors at play, but just looking at the data, there doesn't appear to be a connection between masks and COVID numbers.
The biggest problem that I have with this video is that this guy says throughout the video that the mask rules really are going against liberty and freedom. That shit is so fucking stupid that it hurts my brain. No! It's not going against freedom at all. The guidelines are there to keep you safe.
Oh yes, I'm aware that the intention is to keep people safe, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't infringe on freedom. You see, if somebody's forcing you to wear a mask you don't want to against your will, you lose the right to make the decision whether or not to wear a mask. Like, that's very clearly a curtailment of freedom. Like, you're being stripped of the right to make a choice that you once had. Now, you can argue that it's a worthwhile curtailment of freedom. You can argue that the freedom that we're expected to give up is worth the benefits that come from it. That's a conversation I'm willing to have, but you can't really argue that mask mandates don't infringe on liberty, at least to some extent, because they very clearly do.
Calling it unconstitutional is fucking stupid and so blatantly wrong.
Well, how exactly do you know it is wrong to say that these orders are unconstitutional? Let's for a moment put aside the discussion about the ethics of mask mandates and simply focus on the legality of it. In a lot of places where mask mandates are being implemented, they're not going through the proper democratic legislative process. They're being ordered by state governors under emergency powers. Now, the problem with this is that emergency powers tend to be very specific and narrow. A lot of left-wing governors seem to think that emergency powers are some kind of carte blanche for the government to do whatever they want, and that's not really the case. As a matter of fact, Andrew Cuomo of New York and Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan have both got their hands slapped by their state Supreme Court for abusing their emergency powers. And I would encourage everyone watching this to look up the Constitution for your state or country you live in to determine if your governor or political leader has the authority to actually do what they're doing.
And it also doesn't help that he strawmans Professor Stick at some point. Such as when he said that he thinks that you shouldn't listen to doctors who don't agree with the COVID rules. No, Professor Stick didn't say that at all. His point was that the doctors Computing Forever cited are a laughingstock in the healthcare community.
I'm aware that Professor Stick's point was that the doctors that Computing Forever cites were criticized by other professionals in the field. I was primarily asking for a link to these criticisms. I mean, simply asking someone to provide a source for a claim that they make doesn't strike me as particularly unreasonable.
I'm sorry, but that is a very legitimate reason to not trust them. If someone has a bad reputation, there usually is a good reason for it. It's more than just simple disagreements. I doubt those doctors would be a laughingstock if they really were good at what they do.
So this is an example of the bandwagon or appeal to popularity fallacy. Just because someone's being ostracized or ridiculed by other professionals in their field doesn't mean what they have to say is wrong. I mean, going against ideas that are mainstream will generally result in ostracization and ridicule, regardless of whether or not the mainstream idea is correct or not. For example, there was a time when saying the Earth is round, or the Earth revolves around the sun, would get you ostracized and ridiculed. I mean, sure, take the criticisms of what they have to say into account, but the mere fact that criticisms of an idea that's considered mainstream are being ridiculed certainly doesn't on its face mean that those criticisms are invalid.
Hell, one of those people that Computing Forever cited is someone with Thunderfoot debunked. Oh, and by the way, that video is likely going to the opposite list, so I will talk about that video there.
So this is an appeal to authority fallacy. Oh, someone was debunked by Thunderfoot. That must mean they're wrong. As if Thunderfoot is like some kind of infallible word of God or whatever. Now look, I've seen Thunderfoot's videos before, and I have no doubt that he's a smart guy. Just like the rest of us, he's human and prone to error. He can be and often is wrong about things. If you watch Killian's series of videos where he defends the Hyperloop from criticisms made by Thunderfoot, you'll see that even people as smart as Thunderfoot can get things wrong sometimes.
And lastly, there are some things that you aren't meant to question. And having to wear a mask is one of those things. For the exact same reason that you don't question why you have to put on seatbelts in a car. There are laws that say that you are required to wear seatbelts in a car. Would you ever question it? No, you wouldn't. Because you know how fucking dangerous it is to be in a car without a seatbelt on when a car crashes, for example.
So this guy seems to be making the argument that something being implemented for safety somehow makes it beyond questioning. And I'm sorry, but I don't see how this argument could possibly hold water. I mean, I think there are plenty of perfectly valid questions you could ask, even against things implemented for safety. If you're telling me I need to wear a mask to protect against COVID-19, then I think it's completely valid to ask whether or not that mask actually does protect against COVID-19. And as I've mentioned earlier in the video, the numbers call that into doubt. Like if the government said that wearing a tutu and bunny ears everywhere would keep you safe from COVID-19, are you telling me you would just accept that on its face and not even question it slightly? Because according to this guy's logic, that's what you would be expected to do.
If you're gonna call wearing masks tyranny, you might as well call having to put on seatbelts in cars tyranny as well.
So this is a common argumentative strategy used by a lot of supporters of mask mandates. They'll point to other forms of authoritarianism we already have on the books and say, see, we already require this, is it any worse if we require masks? Using the fact that something has already been done as a justification for continuing to do it is known as the appeal to tradition fallacy. And the problem with this is that it doesn't actually address whether or not what you're claiming to be tradition is actually warranted. Something being tradition or a common practice doesn't necessarily mean it's justified, as this type of logic can be, and often has been, used to justify things like slavery and genocide. Not that I'm trying to argue that forcing people to wear a mask is somehow akin to slavery or genocide. I'm just using that as an example to explain why the logic doesn't work. Because I know people are going to watch this and take that out of context, so I'm just going to lay that on the table right now. The other fallacy this commits is it's a category error. It's trying to equivocate two different things that aren't exactly similar. The risks that are intended to be addressed by masks and seatbelts are fundamentally different. Because of this, a justification that might work for requiring seatbelts might not necessarily work for requiring masks. And another important distinction between mask mandates and seatbelt laws is sort of the scope in which they're implemented. You see, you could make the argument that since the government owns the roads, seatbelt laws could be considered legitimate under property rights, since you could argue that as property of the government has the same right to make rules for its property as does any private entity. Whereas with the mask mandates, the government is making rules for other people's property. They're saying that you as a business owner must require masks on your property. I mean, the distinction between the government making rules for its own property and rules for other people's property I feel is also important here.
Because the exact same logic applies there. You do it for safety measures just like you do with masks.
You know, I always wear a seatbelt when I get into a motor vehicle, because the data does show that when you get into an accident, your survival odds go up significantly if you are wearing a seatbelt. But the thing is, I was able to make that evaluation for myself. I looked at the data regarding seatbelts and decided that wearing one is good for my safety. I didn't need the government to shove that decision down my throat. I, as an independent adult, wanted to make an informed, rational decision regarding my own safety. And even if all seatbelt laws were repealed tomorrow, I'd still wear one, because I'm capable of thinking for myself and making decisions for myself. Here's the thing, if it's so abundantly clear that masks are super effective at protecting people against COVID, if your argument for wearing masks is just that solid, then I don't see why you need to go forcing people to wear masks. If the case for masks is as solid as you make it out to be, then I think it wouldn't be hard to just convince people to wear them voluntarily. And that's the biggest thing I want people to take away from my mask videos. I'm not telling people whether or not to wear a mask, because I don't think that's my decision to make. I think that ultimately comes down to you. I think as an independent adult, you should be the one who makes conscious decisions regarding your health. You should be out researching the pros and cons of wearing masks and making the decision. Does that require a little extra effort on your part? Sure. But we can't and shouldn't expect the government to be everybody's babysitter 24/7. I mean, at some point or another, you are going to have to make decisions regarding risk. That's just a part of life. I mean, I think this whole year is a testament as to the absolute disaster that can happen when people think the government can make decisions better than they can. As always, this has been Flossapasa, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.
Fuck the mask order and the new world order. pushing the pedal, politicians and their Satan forces.